want to know, I'm not up for Schwarzenegger at all, but I want to know why you guys are saying he's a Nazi. Are you taking words out of context of like...
No.
Admiring Hitler, what's wrong with saying that? Not saying what he did, but maybe the intelligence he had to get so many people.
Well, there are 2 points to that. First of all, for someone to say they admire Hitler has within it a context. I mean, it's not as though you're saying, I admire a football player, or I admire Kobe Bryant or something. You know, if someone said, I admire Kobe Bryant right now, you might ask yourself, what does that mean? So there's a context there. You can't say it's an abstraction. Secondly, it's not so much that Arnie Schwarzenegger said, I'm going to kill 6 million Jews, I'm going to destroy Germany, I'm going to go to war with Russia. The important thing is the state of mind that he has, which is exemplified in one of the further quotes on that, where he said 95% of the population need to be led. 95% of the population are essentially incapable of making decisions, and you need a leader. Someone like me, I'm going to be a leader. Now, that's a mentality, the same mentality that Hitler had. It's a Nietzschean mentality, Friedrich Nietzsche. The idea that most people are sheep. Most people don't know what to do, and they need someone to tell them what to do. And that's a dictatorial, tyrannical principle. I'll be talking about that in what I'm going to be going over in a couple of minutes. But what you have to do then is look at the other side of it. What was one of the most important things he said in his campaign? We're going to go against special interests. And who did he define as special interests? The Indians and labor. Now, what about the big energy guys who ripped off the state of $70 billion, who financed his campaign, who were on his staff? That's not a special interest? When someone says they're going to go after labor, that's in fact one of the most important things that Hitler was put in power to do, to crush the labor movement, to lower wages for the bankers, for the synarchist bankers. Now, who backed the Schwarzenegger campaign? See, here's the thing that most people miss. They see the smoke and the mirrors and the charisma, and the guy's somewhat interesting. You know, he's a big muscle-bound guy who made something of himself. Most people see that. They don't see what's behind him. He said he's going to run as an outsider. Every person who ran his campaign were insiders. Did people in California get that? No, they interviewed people on the street, and they said, well, we need someone who's not connected to special interests. Well, Warren Buffett's not a special interest. Pete Wilson's not a special interest. The energy companies are not special interests. The tobacco lobby's not special interests. See, what I'm saying is that what most people see of Schwarzenegger is an artificial figure. For example, when he says he knows how to be a leader, and a lot of people who voted for him said they voted for him for his leadership qualities. What, just as an example, do you know anything about what would qualify him to be a leader? I'm not saying you did. I'm just asking if, or does anyone here, can anyone tell me something he's done that would make you convinced he's going to be a leader? What? Yeah, and they all got wiped out. Everyone in his brigade and Predator got killed. Except for him, yeah. See, people don't even question that. They just, yeah, he looks like a leader. He's tough. You have these radio talk show guys that bodies are going to start flying out of windows in Sacramento. Well, that's not what's going to balance the budget. You know, even if you went in and threw a bunch of bureaucrats out the window, that's not going to balance the budget. That's not going to solve the problem. So everything we know about him is a very sophisticated fraud. So the question then is, what do we really know about him? Well, before he was famous, and he wasn't that young. He was 30 years old when he did that interview. He said he admires Hitler. He'd like to have the feeling of being in front of an audience where 55,000 people agree with everything he said. You know, everything he said in those quotes, and these quotes, by the way, are the ones that were later approved by the Schwarzenegger campaign as being the actual quotes. Because the initial ones that came out in the paper were somewhat... They were paraphrases, but the ones we took were the ones that were on his own website. So that's what we're saying, that it's not just that he said it, but the pattern and the parallels and the time in history. See what John said at the very end when he was quoting Lynn from the end of the webcast, or not the end of the webcast, when Lynn was talking about you have to know history. You have to know culture. You have to know how people make decisions. This is what it means to be an organizer. You actually have to know how the people of your generation think. You have to know what shaped the way they grew up and the way they make decisions, so that you're capable of knowing how to move them. What makes them excited? Now, on the one hand, I can tell you my generation, people got passionate about all sorts of things that were ridiculous. And the younger generation has the same kind of things, even in some cases more ridiculous. But why? Because we've been denied the capacity to have passion about those things that are truly important. Those things that actually will determine how a society functions. And this is what I wanted to talk about tonight, the question of drama and tragedy as history, and actually understanding how someone like Shakespeare was a better historian than someone with 35 PhDs and who's written 100 books on English history or Roman history. That actually the ability to understand how people think and how they act and what gets them excited, what moves them, is what's most important in being able to organize, to change people. So if you're not satisfied with my answer yet on Schwarzenegger, I can give you a lot more afterwards. I'm just writing another article on him. Look, he's going to face a $20 billion deficit, most likely. Now, what did he say during the campaign? We're not going to cut health care. We're not going to cut education. We're not going to raise taxes. We're going to repeal the tripling of the vehicle licensing fee. So how is he going to cover a $20 billion deficit? He said, well, I'm going to ask Bush to give me money. Good luck. You know, Bush, if you go ask Bush for $1 to get a cup of coffee, you know, he says, well, what's another $1? We're already $500 billion in debt this year. Bush has nothing to give. Arnie said the two places they're going to look for money is from the Indians, from the casinos, and from labor. They want to bust the labor contracts. Well, that's exactly what Hitler did for the bankers. Now, then you look at the people who are supporting him, like a Pete Wilson, who was a big supporter of this Prop 187. You look at Buffett, who's not a curmudgeon. Buffett is the guy who bought up all of the Enron pipelines when they went bankrupt and so on. So you actually look at the whole picture, and then you ask yourself, well, why did people vote for him? Because the real tragedy is not that Arnie's not what he's cracked up to be. The real tragedy is that the people of California voted for the guy. They voted to put him in. Now, Lynn just wrote a paper recently called U.S. Politics as Tragedy, which is in the October 10th EIR. And he concluded the article with the following statement. Is Tim? Okay, Tim's there. He says, if you think about this question right now, the difference between where most people are in terms of survival, where people are in terms of their aspirations to have a better future, to make sure their children are safe, to make sure that their country is safe, those aspirations versus the reality. Now, Lynn writes, the desire of the great mass of humanity to escape to a higher state of organization of national and world affairs, free of the oppression a continuation of the present world free trade system represents, is the impulse, the passion for the sublime. That is, people want things better. They want, if it's easy especially, they want to make sure the world gets better. This is counterposed to what appears as the manifest greed of those financier and related interests who demand the preservation of their power over mankind at whatever cost this represents for the human species in general. Like a Cheney. The difference between a person who has a genuine desire to improve mankind versus a Cheney who will use his power to grab whatever stream of income he can, whatever loot he can, to protect himself and his connected interests. It is conflict so defined between these two different conceptions, one for the general welfare, the public good, the other for private gain. Conflicts between a ruinous old tradition and the need for the sublime, which define the passions of real history in an elementary way. These passions exist within the population. The function of serious politics is to ennoble the one by freeing it from the shackles of acquired other traditions turned evil in their effects. The rule must be that the true nature of man as a higher species must be served. That was Shakespeare's passion and Schiller's. it is mine. Let it become yours, Lynn wrote, while humanity could still be pulled back from the present brink of a global new dark age. Now, he wrote earlier in this paper that Shakespeare, the historian, understood, quote, the subject of history is the nature of man. Now, I'm going to introduce you to a character who is extremely important for the fact that civilization exists today, that civilization survived the various dark ages that it's been confronted with. He's someone who's not too well known, actually, a Roman figure named Cicero, born in 106 BC. And Cicero played an important role during the period of Julius Caesar, the fight over whether Caesar should reign as an emperor or whether he would be killed. Cicero played an important role 1,400 years later, 1,500 years later, with the creation of the Renaissance. He played an important role 100 years after that with the Tudor Renaissance in England, and 100 years later in the influence he had on Shakespeare. And hopefully, through our work today, we can revive him, not necessarily as a leading figure, because he himself did not make great discoveries or a whole series of great discoveries. But Cicero did serve an important role as a kind of conveyor belt between Plato and the Socratic Academy of Athens and the LaRouche movement today. Now, we're going to start with a scene from the play Julius Caesar. This is why I had to pull Tim out of his deathbed to come down here. It's a scene where we've just had an intense discussion between Cassius and Brutus. Cassius is the one who Caesar doesn't trust because he calls him a lean and hungry man. He has a lean and hungry look. I wish he were fatter, Caesar said, because he thinks he's ambitious because he's lean. And so Cassius is trying to bring Brutus into a conspiracy. And in the middle of this conspiracy, a kind of schlemiel named Casca comes walking through, a schlemiel-y wise guy. Casca comes walking by, and they grab him to find out what was going on. And so we're going to start with the scene. You have Caesar in the distance at the Feast of the Lupercal. The crowd is cheering. There's a lot of noise. Cassius and Brutus have just been working on each other, feeling each other out to see where they stand on this conspiracy. And I believe Aaron is Brutus, Mike is Cassius, and into this scene comes Casca. So let's play the scene, gentlemen.
You pulled me by the cloak. Would you speak with me?
Aye, Casca. Tell us what had chanced today that Caesar looked so sad.
Well, you were with him, were you not?
I should not then ask Casca what had chanced.
Why, there was a crown offered him. And being offered him, he put it by with the back of his hand thus. And then the people fell shouting.
What was the second noise for?
Why, for that too.
They shouted thrice. What was the last cry for?
Why, for that too.
Was the crown offered him thrice?
Aye, Mary was it. And he put it by thrice, every time gentler than other. And every putting by mine honest neighbors shouted.
Who offered him the crown?
Why, Antony.
Tell us the manner of it, gentle Casca.
I can't as well be hanged as tell the manner of it. It's mere foolery. I did not mark it. I saw Mark Antony offer him a crown. Yet, 'twas not a crown neither, 'twas one of these coronets. And as I told you, he put it by once. But for all that, to my thinking, he would fain have had it. And then he offered it to him again. And he put it by again. But to my thinking, he was very loath to lay his fingers off it. And then he offered it to him the third time. He put it the third time by, and still as he refused it, the ravelment hooted, clapped their chapped hands, and threw up their sweaty nightcaps, and uttered such a deal of stinking breath, because Caesar had refused the crown, that it almost choked Caesar, for he swooned and fell down at it. And for mine own part, I durst not laugh for fear of opening my lips and receiving the bad air.
Let's off that, pray you. But did Caesar swoon?
He fell down in the marketplace, and foamed at mouth, and was speechless.
'Tis very like he hath the falling sickness.
No, Caesar hath it not. But You and I, and honest Casca, we have the falling sickness.
I know not what you mean by that, but I'm sure Caesar fell down. If the Tagrag people did not clap him and hiss him according as he pleased and displeased them, as they used to do the players in the theater, I'm no true man.
What said he when he came into himself?
Mary, before he fell down, when he perceived the common herd was glad he refused the crown, he plucked me up his doublet and offered them his throat to cut. And I had been a man of any occupation, if I would not have taken him at a word, I might go to hell among the rogues. And so he fell. When he came to himself again, he said, if he had done or said anything amiss, he desired their worships to think it was his infirmity. 3 or 4 wenches where I stood cried, alas, good soul, and forgave him with all their hearts. But there's no heed to be taken of them, for if Caesar had stabbed their mothers, they would have done no less.
And after that he came thus, sad away?
Aye.
Did Cicero say anything?
I spoke Greek.
To what effect?
Nay, I'll tell you that. I'll never look you in the face again. But those that understood him smiled at one another and shook their heads. But for mine own part, it was Greek to me. I could tell you more news too. Marlus and Flavius, for pulling scarfs off Caesar's images, are put to silence. There was more foolery yet, if I could remember it.
Okay. Thank you.
Back to the devil.
Now, Cicero made his entrance into the play. And this is, according to what Lynn wrote in this essay, the turning point of the play. Because the character, the real Cicero, the historic Cicero, and his death was a turning point in Rome from a republic to an empire. So what seems to us as a very funny kind of throwaway line, did Cicero speak? Aye, yes, he spoke. And, well, what did he say? People who understood it seemed to like it, but 'twas Greek to me, is a crucial reference which shows you that Shakespeare understood what was at stake, what the battles were in that time, and that he was using this image of the silent Cicero, who actually has a few lines later on in the play. He comments on how windy and nasty the weather is. That's his only speaking appearance in the play. And yet he hangs over the play as a kind of phantom, because you don't know what he said, because it was Greek to me, to Casca. Well, what did Cicero probably say? Now, for Shakespeare's audience, many in the audience who are much better educated than your college professors who teach you Shakespeare would have understood what Cicero was saying. Because in Shakespeare's England, Cicero was known. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Shakespeare's England and then go back to the historical figure Cicero. But I want to make it clear that I'm not merely attacking professors when I say this. But the fact of the matter is that Shakespeare's reference to Cicero is an example of the genius of Shakespeare's understanding, both of history and of the people of his era. As Goethe said, and Goethe being the collaborator of Schiller for a period of time, the play Julius Caesar was an effort by Shakespeare to make the Englishmen of his day into Romans. And so the mob scenes that go on throughout the play Julius Caesar were Shakespeare's effort to try and give the people in the pit, in the audience, an understanding of to what their problems were, that they were just a mob. And as we heard from the scene, a mob that when they cheered, their stinking breath nearly choked Caesar. This is the idea, by the way, keep this in mind. What does Nietzsche talk about of the mass of the people? A stinking herd, where only a leader can emerge above it. And this is what Caesar may have seen himself, the original tyrant, the original despot. Caesar served as the sole dictator of the Roman Empire for 3 years before he was murdered. And this was a moment that was a turning point. So let's just start with Shakespeare's England. You actually have to go back to 1500 to about 1510 to understand the importance of the Cicero reference. because it was in that period of time that a new king of England, Henry VII, was transforming England from a backwater island to a modern nation state. Henry VII was the man who defeated Richard III, another one of Shakespeare's great villains. And it was Henry VII who tried to transform England, modeled on the idea of the nation state of Louis XI of France, who had died in 1481, served as King of France from 1461 to 81, and it was his heirs who backed Henry VII in his campaign to overthrow Richard III. And Henry tried to save England, and one of the ways he did it was he brought the best scholars to England to work to establish an academy in London. One of the people he brought in was a man named Thomas Linacre, who was a Platonist. Another man was John Colet, another man named Grocyn. And these were people who first got to Plato through Cicero. They had read Cicero. And through Cicero, they saw the references to Plato. Cicero, for example, on Plato once wrote, "If it were in the nature of God to converse in human words, he would do it in the form of Plato's dialogues." So with Cicero, it's a very clear reference to Plato and this idea of the search or the striving for the divine. So this idea of the Platonic Academy in England, which was set up around people who had read Cicero, who had read Plato, they then helped Henry VII build modern England. Now, their influence was extended into the continent through the character of Erasmus, another one of the great Platonists and Renaissance figures in Northern Europe, who was another Platonist. And then through Erasmus back to Thomas More, another one of the great thinkers in that period of the early 1500s, who had been a collaborator with this Platonic Academy. Thomas More wrote the history of Richard III, which Shakespeare used for his play Richard III. And Shakespeare wrote that almost 100 years, or about 80 years after Thomas More had been killed by Henry VIII. So what you find from the period 1500 to 1600, the period from Henry VII through the period of William Shakespeare, was a battle in England for a domination of the ideas of Plato and the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. It was a battle which they lost in the next 100 years after the period of Shakespeare. So what you're looking at now is the way ideas are used by individuals to shape and transform history. Now, let's look at Cicero himself. What you find is an interesting character. Born in 106 BC, at the age of 27, he went on an extended tour of Greece to study the Athenians. While he was in Greece, he went, of course, to the priestess of Delphi to find out the cult of Apollo, to find out what is his future. And he was told by the priestess of Delphi, maybe one of the few times the truth was told by this particular cult center, he was told, let his guide in life not be popular opinion, but his own nature. He came back to Rome and was known from that time forward as the Greek, the scholar. He was the most popular orator. His view was that philosophy and oration, the ability to speak, to communicate ideas, was the way in which one changes history. Now, there were two great moments in his life. Actually, let me just say something on popular opinion, because on the section on Cicero and Plutarch, because a lot of what Shakespeare took for his play came from Plutarch's lives. Plutarch was a Roman historian who wrote about this period from about 100 through the period of the Augustus Caesar, the early part of the new millennia. And Plutarch wrote in his essay on Cicero the following about public opinion or popular opinion. Public opinion has the strange power of being able, as it were, to erase from a man's character the lines formed there by reason and study. And by the force of habit and association, it, popular opinion, can impress the passions and feelings of the mob on those who engage in politics, unless one is very much on one's guard and makes up one's mind that in dealing with what is outside oneself, one will be concerned only with the practical problems themselves and not with the passions that arise out of them. What he's saying there is that you'll be concerned with solving the problems as opposed to responding to the passions of popular opinion. So you get a very clear sense. Plutarch's reflection on Cicero included this idea on popular opinion. Now, the two major events that shaped Cicero's life, one was from 82 to 79 BC. This was before he went to Greece. And that was the dictatorship of Sulla, the Roman leader. This is at the time when Rome was still technically a republic, but not really. And then the second period was 49 to 44, which was the end of the triumvirate. That is a rule by three people. And that was when Caesar became the lone dictator or tyrant, and what many historians say was the beginning of the Roman Empire. Now, actually, the Roman Empire predates both of them because the Republic really died in about 130 BC with the destruction of the efforts by the Gracchus brothers to reform Rome. But the important thing is Cicero saw these two moments in particular as moments of tyranny, as moments of change in Rome, which reflected the change in the character, the lack of virtue, the importance of corruption in the way the government ran. Thank you, Maria. Now, Cicero was committed to the idea that man is a being of reason, and that part of what reason does is enable man to uncover what he called natural law. And that therefore you study, you learn, so that you can govern your society by these higher principles of law that go beyond popular opinion. In an essay he wrote on the state, which we still have available to us today, Cicero wrote the following about law. True law is reason, right and natural, commanding people to fulfill their obligations and prohibiting and deterring them from doing wrong. Its validity is universal. It is immutable and eternal. Its commands and prohibitions apply effectively to the good man, and those uninfluenced by them are bad. Any attempt to supersede this law, to repeal any part of it, is sinful. To cancel it entirely is impossible. Neither the Senate nor the Assembly can exempt us from its demands, the demands of natural law. We need no interpreter or expounder of it, but ourselves. There will not be one law at Rome, one at Athens, and one now and one later, but all nations will be subject all the time to this changeless and everlasting law, or what we would call principle of law. Now, this is an important conception. The idea that there's a set of universal principles out of which we must derive the way that we live. And he says that all men are capable of understanding those principles, of knowing those principles. Cicero believed in what he called a universal brotherhood of man. He said, it is by helping others that man approaches closest to divinity. So you again see the teachings of Socrates, in a sense without the dialogue here, but the teachings of Socrates on the nature of man and the nature of the state. Cicero wrote another work called Hortensius, which is apparently lost for the most part. But this was a book that St. Augustine said caused him to reconsider his life. It was this book, this work, that caused him to change. And in it, what Cicero wrote is that the pursuit of truth is the worthiest aim of mankind, and the source of all real happiness. So what you see in this one individual, who was a real person, who was a bit vain, who was someone who was known as a joker, someone who would tell jokes as a way of loosening people up, but also to assert himself over and above them. He admitted that was one of his flaws. But he was a legislator. He became a senator. He at one point was one of the 4 people involved in shaping policy in Rome. But he was also someone who lived in a society that was degenerating. In Rome, 1 out of 5 children died at childbirth. 1 out of 3 people born died before the age of 20. It was a very brutal situation. If you were an aristocrat and managed to live, you could have a relatively decent life. If you were a plebeian, if you were part of the lower class, your life was pretty miserable. The best you could hope for, perhaps, was being accepted into someone's army. There were no police forces then. You had gangs of hooligans who governed. It was all privatized, by the way. It was sort of the dream of the modern neoconservatives. You had no expenditures for the state, for police, so if you wanted to protect your neighborhood, you had to go out and hire an army. You know, imagine in LA today if if Schwarzenegger gets his way and repeals this tripling of the car tax without another way to replace it, that's $4 billion that's supposed to go to the cities and the counties to pay for police and fire protection. If that doesn't go through, that is, if he defeats it and that $4 billion is not generated, then maybe you're going to have the Crips and the Bloods hired as local police forces in parts of Los Angeles. And I'm not kidding. A few years ago when Orange County went bankrupt, I wrote an article where I referred to it as Clockwork Orange County, because one of the proposals was that people hire neighborhood watch teams from among the less dangerous gang members to patrol the neighborhood. They asked parents to bring their baseball bats and gloves and coach the high schools because they could no longer afford high school sports. Now, that was, by the way, long after they already ended orchestras and bands. But this idea of privatization, that was Rome. It was a brutal, brutal period of time. Now, if you think about just the brief description I've given you of Cicero, you see what made him an interesting figure for Shakespeare. Because here was a period beautifully described in the mob scenes, where you have, at the very opening of the play, a mob out in the streets. It's like a day off, demonstrating, rabble-rousing. What did Caesar bring to us? He's come back from the war. What did he bring us? And a couple of tribunes are very nervous. They're afraid that the population is going to use this lawlessness to take advantage of others and break up the public order. Now, in the midst of this, you see that the mob, what do they know? What do they know about law? What do they know about right? One of them points out, do you not remember Pompey? Now, Pompey was one of the great generals who had been part of the triumvirate with Caesar. And yet, in a civil war, Pompey was killed. Pompey had been the most popular figure before Caesar. And yet people who were cheering Caesar, they're asked, do you not remember Pompey? No, they hadn't. Cicero makes an interesting point in one of his writings. He says, to be ignorant of what occurred before you were born is to remain always a child. The question, do you not remember Pompey, gets at that. What happens if you don't know what happened? If you don't know history? If you don't know what was behind the establishment of the United States? If you don't know the fights before Henry VII became king? If you don't know what England was like under the Plantagenets? So Shakespeare took it upon himself, as a modern Cicero, as a modern Socrates, as a modern Aeschylus in his time, to tell the people of England these stories on the stage to organize them to understand how fragile their social stability was. For example, the play Richard III. Prior to Henry VII beating Richard III in a war, which happens at the end of that play, you had what was called the War of the Roses in England, where the ruling families were divided, the Plantagenets were divided into the House of York and the House of Lancaster, and they were killing each other for 30 years. It was brutal, bloody warfare, gang warfare over who would be allowed to pillage the countryside. The population had no say in it. The population, the men would be recruited to go into the armies to be killed against their brothers and their cousins from other areas. The women, if they were lucky, would be married and be nothing but a piece of property. If they were unlucky, they'd be raped and dragged off and forced to be essentially slaves for another ruler. This was in England in the 15th century. And Richard III was probably the most brutal of these leaders. And his defeat opened a whole new period by Henry VII, who said, we're going to make England a country with an economy. We're going to free people from the oppression of the Plantagenets. And so that's why they brought the Platonists in, the Platonic teachers, to show people that man is not an animal, that man is not a creature that lives like a horse or a pig that can be bought and sold like a piece of property, but that human beings have a reason for existence, happiness. The idea that you develop your mind for a purpose, and that in fact the best thing for a ruler of a country is to have a population that's developing their minds. That increases the wealth of a society. So that's what you see with the revival of Plato in England at the beginning of the 16th century. And you had a war that went on through the 16th century. You had the Civil War, or the 17th century rather, after the death of Shakespeare, the death of Queen Elizabeth. The Stuarts came in. Shakespeare, writing in 1600, knew that the period of Tudor rule was about to end. And the question was, what will replace it? This is the theme of Hamlet. This is a subtext of Julius Caesar. What happens if the ignorant mob, ruled by its popular opinion, by its passions, what happens if that mob is manipulated? Instead of supporting Brutus, it's won over to Mark Antony. The same thing in England of his day. And so by writing these plays, he's giving people the history of their development, of their nation, in such a way as to move them to become an actor on the stage. Now, how does this work in drama? We've talked about this a lot. I just want to make a couple of points on this because well, let's start with a letter from Cicero in 59 BC, as Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus formed this triumvirate, which ruled over and above the Senate. That is, the Senate had no longer more than a honorary advisory role. Cicero wrote a letter to his friend Atticus and said, that is how things are. Everyone groans about the situation, and not a voice is raised to suggest remedies for it. Sound familiar? So, the sense that you can't win, you can't fight. How do you do it? Well, that's why Shakespeare wrote his dramas. To give people that history, to show them what happens when you don't have people organized to fight for their future. What happens when you submit to the irrational tyranny of someone who comes to power because of their strength, because of their arbitrary will. The triumph of the will that Nietzsche wrote about, that Arnie Schwarzenegger has wet dreams that he's the fulfillment of. Because that's what he's talking about when he talks about he wishes that he had the power of Hitler at Nuremberg. Lynn said, we don't know how big a Nazi the guy is. I mean, it's not that we're saying this guy is patterning himself and preparing to do in California what Hitler did in Germany, but the mindset is there, and if you ignore that, you ignore it at the peril of this state and the nation, and at the peril of your own future. So when you look at this question of what Shakespeare was trying to do, the idea for Shakespeare was, how do you get a population which doesn't know its history, which is susceptible to being manipulated? Gee, he looks so good on television. He sounds good. I like what he said. What did he say? Well, I don't remember, but it was something about improving Social Security. Terminating the debt, yeah. Terminating liberal bureaucrats. It hit me right. What hit you? He looks like he's a leader. We need a leader. Where's he going to lead you? I don't know. I just want a leader. I'm tired of Gray Davis. All right, so you don't like Gray Davis? Let's get a comic superhero. Make him the governor. So what is it? How does Shakespeare address this? Well, you get an audience. Just imagine, I don't know if you know much about the Globe Theater. It wasn't that big. It wasn't small. But you had people sort of like this surrounding a proscenium stage, a stage that jutted out a little bit. But it was, it probably was pretty dark in the theater. And on the stage, you're seeing things happen. Not like a movie. This is something you should think about. Everyone in your generation and my generation, their idea of imagination comes from television and film. You think about, what's a beautiful place? Well, a lot of you have in your mind pictures you've seen of Hawaii or, the Alps, or, maybe some of you the Sahara Desert. I don't know what you see as a place where you'd like to be. But it's from the movies. Most of you probably, if you think back about what you were like as a child, it's from family movies. The actual memory of events is replaced by newsreel, by television. From my generation, what do most people remember about John Kennedy? We remember Walter Cronkite shedding a tear when he said, the President of the United States is dead. That's what we remember about John Kennedy. The visual images of television, of film, which are not necessarily real. Now, what does Shakespeare do? Take the play Henry V, the way it starts. You have on that stage, you have one guy come out. And according to the way he describes himself, he could be a crooked old man. He says, here you have one old man, one person on the stage, telling you about great histories, battles, kings and armies. You can imagine in your mind that the resounding hoofs of the horses as they move across the fields. On this little stage, we see the vast fields of France and so on. And he's painting a picture in your mind, not in your visual apparatus. You're not seeing actually horses on that stage. Although when Kenneth Branagh made the movie Henry V, you do see the horses. You see the armies. You see the whole Megillah. You see the war. You see people getting killed and blood spurting. On the Shakespearean stage, what the prologue says in the chorus to open it is, in your mind's eye, here's what you're going to see. And what great art does is directly address your creative powers, your cognitive powers. What you don't see with your eyes, what you don't hear with your ears. But you take in the case of Julius Caesar, you hear this thing about Cicero. And if you were an educated Englishman of your day, that might have stuck with you. Partly because of the joke. It's Greek to me. We still say that, don't we? Yeah, how was your algebra class today? I don't know. It's Greek to me. So here we have an example of an ironic twist. It was probably true. Cicero probably did speak in Greek. He did after the death of after Caesar was killed. Cicero did give a speech, and it wasn't recorded whether it was in Latin or Greek. But this little irony, here you are in Rome where everyone speaks Latin, and Cicero said something, but they didn't understand it. And what was Cicero talking about? Here he was, the tide had shifted. The average person was willing to accept letting Julius Caesar run things. No power for me. I have no power, but I can probably go have a good time at the gladiator races. Or watch the I guess lions weren't eating Christians at that time. Probably lions were eating Julius Caesar's girlfriend's former husband or something. You had the games, you had the bread and circuses in Rome. And they gave up their power of reason to think about what was right and what they should do for the purposes of that momentary pleasure. As Cicero put this, that when you're uninfluenced by natural law, you become bad. And so Cicero was a lone voice. And by calling out his name, Shakespeare was saying to his audience, look at your own time. Look at what you've accepted. And of course, what happens at the end of the play? Well, after Caesar is killed, you have great armies raised. Eventually, Cassius kills himself. Brutus kills himself. Antony and Augustus Caesar triumph, at least briefly. Cicero's still alive then. And Cicero wrote some attacks on Antony. He called them the Philippics, because they were modeled on the speeches Demosthenes gave against Philip of Macedon. And he went after Antony. He said Antony is corrupt. Antony is out for himself only, not for the good of the nation. And what did it do for Cicero? Well, once Antony took over, and Antony was in total power, he sent his people for Cicero. And they killed him. They cut off his head and his hands. And they brought them to Antony. And Antony had them displayed in Rome. The head of Cicero, the Plato of his day. That's the principle of the sublime. Cicero fighting against a corrupt society, speaking truth, trying to uplift his Roman friends, to try and give them a sense of something better, and paying for it with his life. And he knew this would happen sooner or later. He'd seen many people murdered who had stood up to fight against the corruption in his society. So that's the importance of Shakespeare as a historian, to be able to provide for an audience, to provide for readers, insights into how people live and make decisions, insights into what were the crises of the day, how were they addressed. Now, we should be reading Shakespeare today for that purpose, to get a sense of how Shakespeare viewed man, because ultimately the subject, as Lynn said in the beginning of this paper, Shakespeare adopted the notion that the subject of history is the nature of man. Now, when you study history in school, what do you study? Dates, names, events, as though they were self-evident happenings. Virtually every event in history occurs because of a series of preceding events and developments, including ideas of certain people. People who want to do something to make things better. Sometimes a person who's trying to make things better just doesn't know enough and becomes a tyrant, becomes used by someone powerful. And so if you actually know history, you can't be fooled. And that's how Lynn approaches history. What you saw today with the webcast from Lyndon LaRouche was sort of a Shakespearean drama. A lone figure on a stage talking to you about what's necessary for your future. about what the potential is, what the possibilities are, what's open to us, and what we face if we don't act. And all done with passion, because the key to conveying ideas is passion, not yelling. Some people think yelling is a way of getting an idea across. There's the famous joke Lynn tells about the preacher who, when he's doing a sermon and comes to a passage that he doesn't really understand, he writes in the column, "Meaning unclear, shout like hell." And you've probably had teachers like that who try to cover up what they don't know by looking as though if you ask a question, you're the biggest fool in the world. If you question me on this, I'm sending you for your Ritalin dose. But the idea of passion in drama. How do you live a life like Cicero? How do you live a life like Socrates? Where you spend your time fighting for the truth. You can't do it unless you have a passion for mankind. And a passion for mankind meaning what? That you see in every other person a human, an ideal human quality with a potential to add to all that's available to mankind. Not just for today, but in the future as well. When you organize, this is what you have to do. When you see that great unwashed herd of college students coming towards you, even if they take 8 showers a day, they're still an unwashed herd. They come towards you. What do you got here? I don't like LaRouche. I heard LaRouche is this. I heard LaRouche is a crook. My teacher says Lyndon LaRouche is no good. You look at them and you see a person. As Lynn puts it here, someone who needs to be freed from the oppression of a continuation of the present world free trade system. They may not know what that means, but they still need to be freed from it. If someone has a delusion, if someone has a false axiom, that doesn't make them your enemy. Some of you get confused on this. Someone comes up and says, "I don't agree with you, I think free trade works." And you're almost like the duel at the OK Corral. All right, buddy, let's draw. And have a throwdown in the parking lot at UCLA. No, I mean, what you see is someone who's a victim of an oppression. There are people who are spending billions of dollars to convince everyone on every campus in California that free trade is good, that free trade will work. Free trade's the only system that will work. Now, you've got a handful of people who are paid to basically run around and say free trade is bad, we need no government, we need anarchy, we need to get rid of free trade, but with no solution. So you have people on different sides, both of which have a certain sense of ideological purity and also correctness, self-righteousness. Someone who argues for free trade is usually the most self-righteous of all. You got to lower the barriers. That's the only way you can do this. That's the only way Mexico will ever make any money. Well, Mexico, since we've had free trade, has collapsed. Well, that's because they don't have enough free trade. What'd they say about California? Deregulation didn't work because there wasn't enough deregulation.
Take more poison.
Yeah, we're going to give the patient more poison because the bit we've given them so far didn't work. They're still alive. And then someone who says, I'm against free trade, you ought to let people just do what they want to do. Well, right now, if you let them do that, you're going to get a Bolivia. Chaos. Well, that's better than free trade. So it's always harder to give someone a new idea about how to overcome the problems they face. But you have to be persistent. You have to know what you're talking about. And you have to have compassion for them. As Lynn said not too long ago in talking about some of our former members who basically went over to the other side, he said you have compassion even for the damned. Because you want to know what tormented them to make a wrong decision so you can help them. You don't have to be vindictive. That's why Lynn could say, if I'm president, peace is going to break out all over the world. Because he knows nations, he knows people, he knows history. And that's what we all have to work on. So you work on it through studying Shakespeare. You can see from this little presentation tonight, you take one section of a scene which, by the way, was pretty well acted. They still need to slow down a little bit and speak up a little more, but on the whole it was pretty well acted. And it gives you an insight into two whole periods of history. The Roman Republic versus Roman Empire, and Shakespeare's time, and if you're really thinking, it gives you insight into your own times as well. And if you have that kind of insight, you can organize people. You can bring out the human being in them, the part of them that wants to be better, that seeks the ideal. And it's hard. It's hard to change. It's hard to fight for that ideal potential within you, because there's always something else you'd rather do. You know the old thing where you have the cartoon with the character of you as an angel on one shoulder and the one of you is the devil on the other shoulder? You don't want to read tonight. Come on, there's something going on downtown. Let's get out there and see what's going on. You don't want to read right now. You want to fall asleep and have a dream. So it's hard. It's hard to do what's right, to fight for what's right, all the time. But that's what's beautiful about it, because as you make that struggle, you improve yourself, you make yourself a better servant of mankind, and you create in yourself the potential to help other people do the same thing. That's why an individual like Cicero, and I haven't exhaustively read through everything he wrote, but an individual like Cicero deserves his time, his honor, as a predecessor to the improvements in civilization with the Christians, with the Renaissance, in the modern period. Because they did wage a fight, they did do some good. And that's what you're always looking for in people, to help them emerge in that way. So let me stop at that and take some questions. Yes?
The question of, okay, we have Shakespeare, he talks about history, he knows history, and he access to it. Now, okay, sometimes you have different periods where it's not clear, or you have synarchists actually, and oligarchs faking the history and hiding it from people. Now, how do you approach it? And what is the role of Edgar Poe in this?
Well, that's a very specific case. Let's just take the general case. Most of what we're taught in most of what's in history textbooks is bullshit. I mean, a history textbook, for the most part, is a professor's effort to make some extra pocket money by putting down in some kind of organized form what most people in the history departments believe. Or if they're of the Howard Zinn school, they put down all the orthodoxy of the so-called left and say, every one of my opponents is wrong, this is what's true. Now think about what the quote from Lynn, the nature of man. That's what you're studying in history. So you actually have to embark on an experiment of discovery, or a trip of discovery into the minds of people. What do we know about them? What did they write? What was written in that day? What were the debates? What were the issues? Now think about, just take a simple example. I say simple because I know you're all going to freak out at this. A simple example, Gauss's paper on the fundamental theorem. Now, one of the things we know about that, even if you don't know everything else he said, is that he had the courage to come out and say, Lagrange, D'Alembert, these guys were wrong. So here's someone who's writing a PhD thesis who had the guts to say, the most prominent names in my field today are bullshitters. Now imagine the courage it takes, what was he, 20 at the time? 19? A 19-year-old to attack the most prominent figures in his field. Now, that gives you an insight into Gauss, doesn't it? Just that alone. You read that first section of the paper and you already know something about him. That's what you're looking for in history, those footprints, those signs that tell you that someone was actually waging a fight in their own mind for truth, which is the sweetest and most precious thing of all, the fight for truth. They didn't want to just go along with what people believed and what was accepted. So these are the kinds of things, and that gets you to Poe, because what Poe writes about in his the Murders in the Rue Morgue and the Purloined Letter is a method by which you come to know the mind of the people that you're investigating. And that, the characteristic of thought. So when you look through history, you can see that. And in some cases you find, like the case of Queen Isabella of Spain, did some useful things. She did promote the Christopher Columbus trip. She did eventually come around to fight against Venice, form the League of Cambrai. But she got manipulated by the evil oligarchs in the church, so that in 1492, when she unified the kingdom, she threw out the Jews and the Moors of Spain. So that tells you something about Isabella. There was something going on there. Now, it shouldn't be too surprising then to go from that and see that Isabella had a daughter, Catherine of Aragon, who was the wife of Henry VIII. And her daughter was Mary Tudor, also known as Bloody Mary. You probably didn't know this, but if you order a Bloody Mary, there's a whole history. There's Mary Tudor, the Protestant, who was slaughtering Catholics in England. I'm sorry, she was the Catholic slaughtering Protestants. Replaced later by her half-sister, Elizabeth I, who was the queen when Shakespeare was writing. So you have to spend some time to actually get a sense of what was going on. But once you have an overview, and that people don't lie too much. If they say that the Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 or I think it was 1603, that's probably true. That was probably the date when she died. That in itself doesn't tell you too much. But once you get a sense of the chronology of events, you look for the thinkers, you look for the individuals involved, and get a sense of the character of the period. And that's how you approach history. So you use people like Shakespeare, Schiller, where you have great thinkers who investigated these things. It gives you a great advantage. Yeah, John.
I was thinking of Rome and Mauritius economics lately, and I was looking through this Rome book, and I got this hypothesis is that why was Rome able to last so long when most of the population was just completely ignorant, right? And I came to basically my hypothesis is that they stole the essential discoveries of other civilizations, like the Calpurnians and whatnot, or the Greeks, and that's what I...
They took some, but they mostly destroyed them, wore them down. Rome survived because they were an effective looting operation. And they looted all of the world that they could reach. I mean, Rome was a classic example of a slave labor system. It was incapable of creating something new or good, but it was capable of destroying people, and in the process, looting what they could. I mean, Rome was a slave system. And a slave system, if it's enforced effectively, will provide a certain amount of loot for the slave masters for a period of time. The more you try to loot, the more rapidly you kill off the slaves. I mean, a dead slave is not very productive. But if you have a system of tax farming, a system of looting of grain and food production, you have to keep expanding the area. And this was what happened with Rome. Eventually they expanded the area beyond their ability to either administer it or to effectively bring in the grain. I mean, the Soviet Union had the same kind of problem. To the extent that they were investing in an arms race against the United States, They were they were increasing their food production, but they couldn't bring the food from the fields to market. And so that was part of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. So anytime you have an economic system that's fundamentally based on slavery or cheap labor, it's got an expiration date on it. It's eventually going to blow out. Now, Rome was an efficient slave system for quite a while. But in effect, the decline of Rome was 300 or so years. I mean, in a sense, the period of Julius Caesar, as brutal as it was part of the golden age of Rome. And from that time forward, the rate of killing, the rate of misery increased. What essentially saved the world from the Roman Empire was St. Augustine. Because Rome was becoming, on top of the fact that it couldn't support itself, and that it was no longer able to fight against the hordes of barbarians coming in, what happened at that point is that Christianity was being destroyed. And so Christianity was revived from the outside by Augustine of Hippo, a North African Christian who was originally part of a cult and who read Cicero, who was influenced by Ambrose, and I have to add, by his mother. His mother was very angry at him for not settling down and getting married. And
civilization was saved by a black man?
well, I don't think he was lily white. And yes, not only saved by someone who was not a lily white European, but by someone who had a bad past. And someone who saved it by reviving the works of Plato. So that's part of the lesson. Yeah.
Listening to you talk about Shakespeare reminded me of a few years back I heard vaguely that there was some people trying to discount the existence of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
They said was there some kind of motivation behind that, or was that a hoax? What was that?
Pure malicious evil. There's a professor that we should go visit, in fact, not too far from here, whose father was a major scuzzball named William Yandell Elliott. That was the father. The son teaches where? At Claremont? Yeah. And the father passed on to the son, besides his bad genes, passed on to the son the desire to discredit Shakespeare by saying that it was probably Sir Francis Bacon who wrote the works of Shakespeare. Now, other than the fact that Bacon was an Aristotelian lunatic whose main function in life was to promote the Hobbesian view of the Venetians who were fighting to take over England after the death of Queen Elizabeth and after the death of Shakespeare, Bacon showed no talent for writing at all. Now, why would someone be freaked out that there was a guy like William Shakespeare? Now, this just shows you they want to destroy. It's the same reason that Milos Forman made the movie Amadeus, to destroy the image of Mozart, to say that Mozart really he's a very talented pervert. Same reason that the movie Immortal Beloved was made about Beethoven, to make Beethoven look like a rock star who trashes a hotel room. The nature of true creativity is something that an evil person can't grasp, something that they despise, because the truly creative people are always on the other side. They're on the good side. That's why the truly creative people also are usually victims of assassination and slander. Shelley is an example. Percy Shelley. Marlowe, who was someone Shakespeare admired, a great playwright, a great English Republican, was murdered in a barroom brawl at a relatively young age. So the great creative geniuses who change civilization are targeted by the oligarchy, which are attempting to say creativity and insanity go hand in hand. And not everyone can be creative. Most of you are dull. Most of you, the best you'll ever do is you'll learn to whistle a Mozart tune. Memorize a line from Shakespeare. But be a creative being? Forget it. You're going to be a welder. You're going to be a mama. You're going to be a school teacher, which means a dispenser of drugs to children. That's what you're being trained for. Don't give me this crap that you can somehow get at this creativity. And at the same time, what do they say? The truly creative person has no idea that what makes them creative. It's an anomaly. Now, if you study the truly creative artist, what do you find? They worked their asses off. They came out of a tradition. There's no, some guy pops out of the head of Zeus and suddenly is writing plays. No, there's an art. There's an amount of work. There is a question of the agony of creativity, because you're fighting against the impulses you have to be popular, to be accepted, to go along. You're doing things that people may not understand. Your parents may say, "Oh, you know, it's nice that you're interested in this, but you got to get a job, get married, settle down, have 2.4 kids, and take care of me in retirement." You say, "But you know, what do you want to be when you grow up?" "I want to be a writer." "Oh, that's wonderful, but you have to be practical, honey." That's what you get. So on this question of why do they do these things, I'm 190% convinced there was a guy named William Shakespeare who read a lot, grew up with other actors who were insightful, who watched people perform and got insights into human nature, who studied things such as Plutarch. Plutarch's lives were read by the educated Englishmen of the time, who worked hard on these ideas and decided he was going to live by writing plays. And that's not so hard to understand. The fact that he was tied to a Republican network in England makes perfect sense, because otherwise he wouldn't have been able to do what he did. The fact that he and his friends were trying to organize Queen Elizabeth to improve England, maybe even they had some ideas of doing something to keep the Stuarts out, that's totally understandable. Because Mozart was organizing to bring the American Revolution to Austria. Schiller was organizing and writing and doing his work to bring the American Revolution to Germany. Pushkin was trying to do that to bring the American Revolution to Russia. The ideas of the revolution. So the fact that great artists turn up as revolutionaries, not just in their art, but in their axiomatic approach to things. In other words, they don't accept axioms. A revolutionary starts with the idea that if I see an axiom, I'm going to bust it. Kick them in their axioms. Now that's the way you organize a population. Someone says something, you say, "Why do you think that?" And they say, "Well, that's what I was taught." You say, "Well, you don't know it, do you?" "Well, that's what my mother always told me." But you don't know it yourself, do you? Sometimes mothers are right. You got to account for that. Sometimes if they tell you to clean up your room and do your homework, they're actually trying to help you out. Some of you apparently had baby boomer mothers who never told you to clean up your room. I mean, doing your homework may not have been the right thing, but cleaning up your room, that's relatively important. So, look, the stuff about Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. What a bunch of bunk. You know, I think we ought to go and tell William Yandell Eliot's son, we don't really believe he's the son of William Yandell Eliot, because someone that evil couldn't have produced offspring. We just have to say that your mother was impregnated by someone else because your father was so impotent, the only people he could create were Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Samuel Huntington. And those had to be test tube babies. Who else had a question? I can take a couple more questions. Yeah.
Other than writing, did Cicero have any type of organized fight? I mean, any type
Oh yeah, he was a lawyer, and one of the ways he became famous was that he prosecuted the Catiline conspiracy, which was a conspiracy around a guy named Catiline, who I don't think was the leader because he doesn't seem to have too much to him, but he was planning on murdering a whole bunch of the figures of the Senate. And Cicero basically organized an operation where they infiltrated the Catiline conspiracy's group. They infiltrated them. They got a couple people to confess, and they broke up the conspiracy. And later Cicero was in trouble because of this, because a couple of the people ended up being put to death without having been through a full trial. And Cicero, despite the fact that he didn't like that happened, basically it was a war. It was a war to save the Republic. And people used this against him. He was exiled from Rome because of that. So here he was known as someone who had acted to save Rome. So he was very much involved in these kinds of matters, and legal questions and political questions. In fact, there is evidence that Cicero was very pissed off that he wasn't invited into the conspiracy against Julius Caesar. Now, one of the interesting questions in Caesar, in the play, is what would have happened to Brutus had he actually talked to someone other than the conspirators about what he was planning on doing. There's the famous scene that we've been working on with Brutus and his wife. Some of you, Miwa and Mike, have done that. Some other people have done it. Sylvia, you've done it, right? No? Ingrid, yeah. But the scene where Brutus's wife, Portia, is an educated woman. And she sees Brutus is all tied up in knots. She comes to him and says, Tell me what's going on. And Brutus, played as a petulant baby boomer by Wes, but other people played him different. Brutus won't tell her. He won't unburden himself. Now, what if he would have said to Portia, well, all right, you're my wife, I might as well tell you, we're going to go whack Caesar. Portia might have said, what, are you insane? She might have. Suppose they went to Cicero and they said, Cicero, you can speak Greek with the best of them. You can argue. You're a lawyer. You've been through all this experience. We want to ask you a question. Should we assassinate Caesar? Now, Cicero was trying to deal with this question. Whether it's legitimate to kill kings, to kill rulers. This was an important issue after Shakespeare's death. There's a famous debate over whether it was legitimate to execute James I, or was it Charles? Charles I of England, who Cromwell had his head cut off. And Milton wrote an essay in defense of regicide, some of the arguments of which helped shape the thinking of people in writing the Declaration of Independence. Not that they agreed that you should kill the king, but that you have a right to rebel. How far does that go? Anyway, Cicero was very active in these other things. Let me just follow this theme for a second, though. When is it legitimate to rebel? When is it legitimate to pick up arms? When is it legitimate to kill your oppressor? These are important issues that people have debated. And if you actually look in the Declaration of Independence, they go through the grievances against the king and the British. Taxation without representation, I think, is number 13 or something like that. You get these right-wing Rush Limbaugh wannabes who run around saying, taxation, that's what the American Revolution was about. They're idiots. They don't know history. They don't know anything. But if you actually look, these debates that were going on at the time, where people went back and they said, well, what did Cicero say about this? Did Plato say anything about this? When is it legitimate to kill a king? When is it legitimate to kill a dictator? I'm sure Cicero was thinking about that question during that whole period of time from 49 to 44 BC. Brutus could have gone to him and said, give me your best learned exposition on this. But Cicero might have convinced him not to do it. So Brutus wouldn't tell anyone. He made his decision. It must be by his death. Once he decided that, he was in the conspiracy. They killed Caesar, and what happened? They got eaten by the mob. Because the problem wasn't Caesar, it was the mob. It was the corruption of Rome, the destruction of the image of man in Rome, which is actually what what Cicero was trying to address. So that gives you a sense of the importance of these kinds of debates and these kinds of discussions. And so next time you see the scene where Cassius and Brutus are having a debate or a discussion, trying to feel each other out on whether they would support the killing of Caesar or not, this is the kind of thing that's going on. What you're seeing in the language is somewhat of a way of avoiding what they're really thinking as they're checking with each other. What do you think? Would you join me in this? Is this the right thing to do? And so on. When you know that, when you act the scene, you're showing the inside of Shakespeare's developed thinking, his hypothesis of how these characters carried out this debate. And that's why good drama acted well is so powerful. It has such an effect on an audience that, as Schiller said, that you leave the theater better than when you came in. One more question? I'll take one last question if there is one.
I read somewhere in the essay, I forget where, but I read that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights were actually written, the way it was written actually supports the way that they were colonizing the land at the time. Written to support the kind of like, I don't want to say free market, but the kind of capitalist intentions that he had, the way that it was written by the people who wrote it. And that right now, the way we interpret it is a little bit different than the way they had intended initially.
No, the people who interpreted it as an imperial doctrine are the ones who don't understand what the founding fathers were thinking. You see, this is, again, you have to look at the debates, and there are volumes written of the documents and the discussions that were going on. You look through something like the Federalist Papers, and you have to think about something. If you sit down and try and read the Federalist Papers today, it's not easy. There were barroom brawls over these things when they were written. People, what do you mean by this? And Hamilton knew he was stirring up people to debate these questions. But what's the issue of the founding documents of our nation? It again goes to this question of the nature of man. Can man organize a society where you can trust institutions of self-government or not? Now, the people who argue that all the founding fathers were imperial capitalist pigs who were out to back up slavery and oppress the poor farmers of the country don't understand the first thing about the real issues that were taken up. They don't understand anything about who Benjamin Franklin was. They don't know anything about the relationship between Franklin's scientific experiments and his philosophical thinking. I mean, the first thing about Benjamin Franklin is, what's the guy doing out there in the middle of a storm flying a kite? Is he just some kind of nut? The way, like a mad scientist portrayed by Christopher Lloyd or something? Or was he doing something? Was he looking for something? Was he looking for a principle? So, again, the point that John had picked up earlier from Lynn's briefing today is crucial. To know history, you have to know people. You have to know yourself. You have to know the actual, what causes people to act in certain ways. And the reason people say things like all of them were just self-interested is because they're projecting their own feelings. The idea that you could actually fight for a principle and give your life for a principle doesn't exist among cowards.
Yeah.
A coward cannot imagine someone risking their life for someone else. Just let me finish this point. So someone who says, we're going to go to war against the British Empire, we, a few thousand Americans with no material, with no money, we're going to go to war against the world's biggest empire because we want to exploit the Indians and grab the land. That doesn't make sense. Because you're going to end up, good chance you're going to lose and get killed. They pledged their lives, their honor, and their fortune. Why? Because there was an idea they were committed to. And the kind of cowardly, sniveling baby boomer historians who write most of the texts that are studied now in college are people who are too frightened to take a stand for anything. They'll take a stand as long as it'll get them laid. That's what my generation was like. The anti-war movement. It was cool to be against the war because you might be able to convince a free love chick to go to bed with you. That's the mentality of the baby boomers in the 60s. Some of them say, well, war is not good, so make love, not war. No, you got to defeat the enemy that's pushing the war. Oh, but then you get in trouble. So, this idea that you often hear, the Howard Zinn theory of history, it's a cowardly view. Someone who's afraid to really investigate his own axioms. And it's the dominant counter history. You have on the one hand Rush Limbaugh, who says, these were great men who were free traders. And Limbaugh doesn't know a damn thing about history. The only thing he knows about is the history of his maids getting drugs for him. Then you get on the other side these left-wingers who say, the United States was bad from the beginning. All these governments are bad. There's never been a good government because man is evil. Someone should ask Howard Zinn, you think your wife is evil? You get this all the time. These preachers who preach about man is evil. I'd like to ask the preacher, so your wife's evil? Now the wife has probably been brutalized and brainwashed into saying, oh yes, I'm evil. So the question is there truth? Can you pursue truth? To pursue truth, you have to have courage. That's what I was trying to get at earlier. It's not easy to do what's right. There's no easy pathway. There's no easy way to master Gauss. There's no easy way to figure out the ideas in a Mozart piece. There's no easy way to get Shakespeare except work on it. But if you work on it and you're out pursuing truth, you'll be extremely happy because you'll be making a new friend, Shakespeare. Someone that you actually can rely on in terms of helping you shape the way you look at the world. And that's why classical drama, classical culture, is a superior form to anything else that's out there. You want Eminem to be your friend? Hey, Em, what's up, man? What are we going to do about Ashcroft? Don't blow my buzz. All right, so I'm going to stop at that. Now look, those of you who are not already signed up, we have a weekend cadre school a week from this Friday. We're going up to some beautiful location somewhere north of here. It's a secret. I think only the Calneys know where it is, and they're not talking. We're going to have better food than the potatoes and the ramen noodles you've been getting served. And we're going to have a hell of a good time. We're going to have a dialogue with Lynn and with the East Coast youth, because they're going to have a cadre school the same weekend. So we'll have a hookup of the East and the West Coast with Lynn on Saturday morning. We're going to have some classes from Phil, Laney, and myself. We've got a group of people who are putting together a panel which will include some specific experiments, pedagogical experiments, and then beyond that we'll be having discussion full-time about music, art, history, and the real nature of man. And all this for, what is it, $70, $50? $50. But you got to sign up quickly because spots are limited. So if you're not already on this cadre school, talk to the person you talk to as an organizer and make sure you're coming, and see if you have some friends who you want to wake up before it's too late. So this will be a week from, it'll be Halloween Eve when we leave, right? The 31st? Is that Friday? Yeah. So just treats, no tricks. All right.